What's good, everybody? It's Robo back with another video, and today I got my college football week 8 picks. We've got 59 FBS games this week, and I'm going over every single one of them. It's looking like a loaded slate of games, but before I get into those, let me go ahead and recap the week 7 results. Week 7 was another good one for the picks. We got some incredible games as well, and overall I went 30, 21, and 1 against the spread. A few surprises and no-shows from teams I really hope to see better from, but heading into week 8, I've got the spread record almost 30 wins above 500. I got to keep rolling those, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started in order kickoff time as usual. First up, Tuesday night, we've got 3 games, starting with Troy at South Alabama. Both of these teams have had rough seasons record-wise, but South Alabama's looked like the clear-cut better team this season. Last week was a pretty sloppy performance, putting up almost 500 yards and only 16 points to show for it. But back home, I'd expect Gio Lopez to get the ball in the end zone more often against just a really bad Troy team. I thought Tucker Kilcrease looked solid last week, and some of these weekday games can be sneaky close, but the Jags offense has a lot of life when they get hot. I like them to roll again here. I've got the Jags 38-21. Next up, Tuesday night is Middle Tennessee and Kennesaw State. Just 1 win and 10 losses combined between these two teams, and Middle Tennessee got absolutely manhandled last week when I picked them to cover on the road at Louisiana Tech. Usually I wouldn't go back after a performance like that, but this Kennesaw State team really hasn't been competitive at all this season and has gotten destroyed on the ground. I think Middle Tennessee's shown a bit of an offensive pulse at times this year, and they could definitely come alive enough here to cover just 10 points. Give me Middle Tennessee 34-20. The final Tuesday game is Louisiana Tech at New Mexico State. Both teams played weekday games last week and got opposite results. New Mexico State looked pathetic against Jacksonville State, and Tech surprisingly dominated Middle Tennessee at home considering the 2 games prior. But maybe last week started a little heater for this team. New Mexico State's defense cannot stop the run whatsoever this season, but on the other side, Louisiana Tech hasn't found much success on the ground either. I definitely don't think New Mexico State's going to win this game with how they defend, but I also don't love laying double digits to Tech on the road. I'll go 31-23 Tech for a final score. On to Wednesday night, we start with one of the better looking weekday games of week 8, Western Kentucky at Sam Houston State. Both of these teams last played against UTEP and nearly got identical results. These two teams look like genuine threats to Liberty in the Conference USA. I think we get a back and forth affair with Veltkamp trying to sling it on a pretty solid defense, and Sam Houston looking to continue their ground dominance with Hunter Watson leading the way right now. I can see this one coming down to the final possession, but I really think Sam Houston's defense has looked great this season, and they've got a real impressive win over Texas State already. I think they've got enough on both sides of the ball to be able to win this game. I'll go 31-27. The late game is FIU at winless UTEP. UTEP coming off another blowout loss against a much better team in Western Kentucky, and FIU off an overtime loss to Liberty. I thought it would go a lot different, but if it weren't for the penalties, fumbles, and a late collapse, Liberty could have blown them out. FIU is still pretty tough to read, but I just don't think they're good enough to really love in this spot. UTEP has to know they've got a shot in this game playing at home. Cade McConnell is a game-time decision, but I think Locklear's played enough to run the offense in a similar way. They're an underdog for a reason, but I'm going to take UTEP to pick up their first win of the year this week. They've looked decent on the ground and have forced some turnovers defensively and could definitely get 1 or 2 in this game. Give me UTEP in an upset, 27-24. Georgia State at Marshall is the first of 2 Thursday games this week, and both teams have some questions at the quarterback position. Georgia State will potentially give Zach Gibson a look this week over Christian Valu, and Marshall has gone back and forth between Earl and Braxton lately, with both looking terrible in last week's loss. A few weeks ago, I would have thought Marshall would be able to control this game, but with how the offense looked last week on top of the dual quarterback stuff, I just don't really see them winning this game by double digits. Georgia State is going through a recent rough patch, but the potential quarterback change could provide a bit of a nice spark. Time will tell, but I definitely think Marshall wins this game by a touchdown or less. I've got a 30-24 final. Next is Virginia Tech hosting Boston College. Both teams coming off a bye, but as of late looking completely different. Boston College has really struggled in 3 straight games now, just one of them being without Castellanos, and Virginia Tech nearly upsetted Miami and then dominated Stanford on the road. Kyron Drones looks like he's finally gotten in his groove, and Tootin's running pretty well right now. BC's defense has done a decent job at limiting offenses this season, but after the Virginia game, I'm much lower on their chances of winning this one, especially having to go into Blacksburg at night. I just think there's too much going the Hokies' way right now. Give me Virginia Tech 28-17. We've got 4 games Friday, starting with Florida State at Duke. Duke sitting at 5-1 on the year, and FSU the opposite at 1-5. Obviously, Duke has had a fairly easy schedule at this point, though, and despite the horrendous start, at least the Noles have played some decent comp. Brock Glenn should be getting the start again this week after an okay showing against an elite Clemson defense. Trusting this Florida State team could be pretty dumb, but outside of the SMU game, the defense has done somewhat of a decent job this year. I have to think Glenn has a better day, as Duke is not a Clemson-level defense, and even if they don't win, they're coming in as underdogs here, so I do see some value. As long as they show up, I think they'll win a close one against a bit of an overrated Duke team in my eyes. Give me the Noles by 3, 23-20. Next up is Oregon at Purdue, with Oregon coming off a win in their biggest game of the year over Ohio State, which puts them in an obvious letdown spot on the road this week at Purdue. Now, prior to last week, Purdue was looking like a lost cause, but after Hudson Card was ruled out, Ryan Brown put on an absolute show in the second half at Illinois, throwing for over 300 and rushing for over 100 on the day, nearly pulling off an overtime upset over the Illini. I think Purdue is going to come into this game feeling great about their offensive surge and obviously knowing what they're up against. Big Ten teams are just 3-10 while traveling 2+ time zone as well, but I think this one gets out of hand after a decent first half or so from the Boilermakers. I've got them covering though with a 42-17 final score. Late Friday night, we've got BYU looking to continue to roll as they host Oklahoma State this week. The Cowboys got a much-needed bye as the last 3 games have just been beyond ugly, all losses to Utah, Kansas State, and West Virginia. Maybe the week off will help this team reset, but now with 3 conference losses, a championship is basically off the table. BYU's been flat out dominant at home so far and are putting up numbers on both sides of the ball right now. It'll take a vintage Ollie Gordon performance, which we haven't seen this year, for the Cowboys to pull this one off. But the way BYU has defended this season, I don't see that coming. Give me BYU 34-21. The final weeknight game is Fresno State at Nevada, with Nevada coming off a huge win taking down Oregon State. They did struggle to stop the run as I figured, but 4 turnovers and a run game of their own absolutely carried them last week. Fresno State's coming off a tough-fought loss to Washington State in which penalties absolutely killed them. I think they honestly outplayed the Cougars, but just couldn't take advantage. I still think this Fresno team has the pieces to contend the Mountain West. They just need to play cleaner football. And even on the road, with Nevada coming off that win that big, I could see Fresno taking advantage of what is likely a lesser team riding on a high. Especially with a stronger Fresno State run defense. Give me Fresno on the road, 30-23. Miami at Louisville is one of the more slept-on games of this weekend. Obviously not one of the top 2 or 3 based on rankings, but this could be a sneaky upset pick. Miami hasn't been playing up to their standards as of late, but has 2 big comeback wins, and Louisville really hasn't been great lately, but survived a scare from Virginia last week on the road, and still has plenty of talent on both ends to make this game interesting. Tyler Shook hasn't been super sharp, but what a year it's been for freshman running back Isaac Brown and Alabama transfer receiver Ja'Cory Brooks. They both have to show out here to have a chance in this one, but Miami still hasn't given me enough reasons to fade them, and this line is pretty tight. Give me the Canes to cover, 34-27. Clemson will look to keep on rolling as they host Virginia this week, and in previous years I'd say this is a cakewalk for Clemson, and it could still prove to be, but these past few weeks Virginia's looked really competitive, taking down Boston College and hanging with Louisville. Anthony Calandria has performed really well for Virginia, and while I don't think they have a real chance of beating Clemson, especially on the road, it wouldn't surprise me if they hung around enough to cover a 3-touchdown spread. I think they've proven to have gotten much better since the Wake Forest win, and they just flat out have a stronger secondary than Wake did last week. I think Clemson is in for a tougher test here, but they're clicking enough to pull away eventually. I am going to take Virginia to sneak a cover, though, with a 35-17 final. Indiana is still undefeated now, sitting at 6-0, albeit with a very easy schedule so far, but they've been impressive and look like a genuinely good Big Ten team right now. But this will be their toughest test to date by a good margin, in my opinion, with Dylan Raiola and Nebraska coming to town fresh off a bye week, giving them some extra time to prepare. Raiola is still going through some growing pains and has already had a few hiccup games, but I'm a believer in his arm talent being able to make plays to keep Nebraska in tougher games. And this is a game where I think he does show up enough to stick around. I do think Indiana pulls this one out at home against the freshmen, but they're going to definitely be on upset alert. I've got a 24-21 final for Indiana. Missouri finally found the offense last week over UMass, but we'll see if that means much, as UMass is easily one of the bottom 10 or so teams in the country. This week, Missouri hosts Auburn, and it sounds like Luther Burden's expected to play. Missouri's looked really rough lately up until last week, and they absolutely need his playmaking ability. With the way they've been playing, I wouldn't hate anyone taking Auburn, but I also haven't seen anything from the Tigers to suggest they're going to be able to pull this one off on the road either. Other than getting an extra week to prepare, this Auburn team just hasn't looked very good, and hanging around with Georgia lost a lot of value after Mississippi State just did the exact same. I think this line has gotten too low. I'm expecting Missouri to build off of last week and put Peyton Thorne in tough situations. I like Missouri here by nearly double digits, 30-21. Army's finally been ranked in the AP poll this week, coming in at number 23, and they'll look to keep it that way this weekend against East Carolina. And there's good reason to expect that to be the case, as ECU's coming off a disgusting blowout loss to a bad Charlotte team, giving up over 300 yards on the ground in the process, which bodes terrible for this matchup, as we all know how strong the Army option attack's been this season. But on top of that, the dual threat ability of Bryson Daly against a pretty weak secondary now. I think Army matches up well offensively here, and both Garcia and Hauser performing the way they did last week. It gives me a lot of confidence in the Army defense as well. I'm going to go with a 38-17 final here. Wisconsin at Northwestern looks like a sneaky good game this week, with both teams coming off some big-time performance of the road. Wisconsin putting a whooping on Rutgers, and Northwestern upsetting Maryland. Both of these offenses found some life that could lead to a great game here. I think Northwestern has a strong enough defense to slow down what Wisconsin's been putting up, but at the same time, the same can be said on the other side. So for me, it comes down to which team I think is better, and I definitely think that's Wisconsin, especially as of late. They absolutely manhandled a decent Rutgers team, so give me them to keep it moving with a 27-17 win over Northwestern. Rutgers need a bounce-back game in a big way this week as they host 1-5 UCLA. Coming off back-to-back losses in Nebraska and Wisconsin, this is an obvious opportunity for the Knights to get back moving towards bowl eligibility and beyond. UCLA could also see this as an opportunity to pick up a much-needed win as well with the way the Knights offense has played recently. But as I mentioned earlier, Big Ten teams are just 3-10 when traveling 2+ time zones so far, and this is a full country trip for the Bruins, who just haven't gotten anything going really. I'm going to take Rutgers by about 2 scores, 28-17. UConn is back off the bye week hosting Wake Forest, who probably wishes last week was a bye as well, as they got demolished at home by Clemson. You can't really hold them against them with how the Tigers been playing, but they got absolutely gashed defensively, which is becoming a theme for Wake so far, giving up 30+ in each of their last 5. UConn struggled big time against Temple 2 weeks ago, but I picked it and kind of expected it after the offensive explosions they had the 2 games prior. But with that past them now and up against a rough Wake defense, I can see them coming alive again. I like UConn to take care of business and take the rough season to continue for Wake Forest, 34-30. Arizona State picked up a huge win last Friday over a Utah team that did have Cam Rising playing, and they looked really good in the process, especially Cam Scatterbo, who's established himself as one of the best backs in the country. And now they'll have to come back on the road as they head out to Cincinnati to take on a solid Bearcats team led by Brendan Sorsby. This is definitely a letdown spot here, but based on how Arizona State has played this season, I trust their offense to show up on the road. I think Cincinnati got a little lucky facing backup quarterbacks for UCF last week, and they had a rough day on the ground despite the win. I think being left out of the AP Top 25 is going to keep the Sun Devils hungry another week as they pick up another win on the road here, 31-28. Louisiana hits the road this week to take on Coastal Carolina, who's had a pretty up and down year for a 4-2 team. But last week's loss to James Madison was just a case of losing to a far superior team on the road. This Louisiana team is a tough draw to rebound with, though, sitting at 5-1 and coming off 3 straight wins over Wake, Southern Miss, and App State. They failed to cover in back-to-back weeks, though, and I think this is going to be a tough matchup. Coastal's done a great job avoiding sacks, and the offense has shown up every game this season besides JMU. This one's going to come down to turnovers and slowing down the Louisiana offense. Coastal hasn't fared well against the running team so far, and they'll have to do that here, and I think they get just enough to get it done as underdogs. I've got Coastal close, 30-27. Oklahoma just got dismantled by Texas last week, not showing up whatsoever offensively, putting up just 3 points. Now, yes, Texas is an elite championship contender, but not even to show up against a game that important is a clear sign of the issues this team's having this season. I don't expect any major changes anytime soon, and South Carolina can play some defense when they're feeling it. This will obviously be a much easier matchup for the Sooners defense as opposed to Ewers and the Texas O-line, but it'll be another tough one for the team as you just can't expect much out of the offense right now. Regardless of that quarterback between Hawkins and Arnold, I think they are able to rely on winning a defensive battle. I'll go 23-17 the Sooners. Eastern Michigan and Central Michigan face off this week with both coming off losses in conference. Central just running out of time after a big comeback attempt, and Eastern finally with a dud performance up against a decent Miami, Ohio team desperate for a win. This will be an important one for both teams aside from the in-state bragging rights, and it really just depends on who bounces back better to me. In terms of a matchup, both defenses have slightly favorable matchups in how they play, but both offenses can score some points. Eastern showing a bit more consistency to me though, and will definitely be looking to give their fans a better showing this week with a more winnable game. I like EMU again, 30-24. We've got another ugly matchup with Tulsa and Temple, 2 teams that Army has absolutely dismantled in recent weeks, and both coming off a bye week last week. There is a chance it could be a little fun for viewership though, as both squads ranks among the worst defenses in the entire country, and we've seen slightly improved play out of the Temple offense in the last 3 or 4 games. This is 100% a toss-up game to me though. Both teams are desperate for a win and have a lot of potential changes with depth charts coming off a bye week. For picking purposes, I do think we've seen some better games out of Temple besides Army, and playing at home, I think they've got a real shot at win number 2 here. I'm going to cautiously take them to do so. I'll go 31-27 Temple. The third Saturday in October is here as Tennessee takes on Alabama with both teams coming off games to forget. Bama struggling with South Carolina after the Vandy loss, and Tennessee doing the same with Florida after the Arkansas loss. Someone has to come alive and win this game. Hopefully it ends up being both teams so we can get a really incredible show. But Nico's really been struggling lately, and that's the main reason why I'm going to take Alabama to win this one. I think Bama's defense is going to make an effort to get pressure on Nico and force him to make some plays. And Jalen Milroe has proven he's capable of winning the big games with Georgia a few weeks ago. This one definitely comes down to Alabama's defense doing their job and keeping Nico out of rhythm though, because if he gets hot, Bama will be right back on the ropes for a 3rd straight week. But I like the Tide to avoid that happening with a 27-20 win over Tennessee. Up next is Notre Dame at Georgia Tech, another potential sleeper game as we've seen both the good and bad of Notre Dame this season, but it's been mostly dominance as of late. They're coming into this game with some unfortunate news though, as superstar corner Ben Morrison's out for the year, which is a huge blow to the Irish secondary. I definitely think that helps Tech's offense as he was a fantastic piece they no longer have to worry about, but the main part of this game is going to be slowing down a red-hot Irish offense. Riley Leonard's been in full control and the run game's done their job. If Tech is able to get some stops, I think we could be in for a great game in Atlanta. With this spread up in the double digits, I have no problem taking Georgia Tech to cover, as I definitely think they can show up for this one and have the weapons on offense and put some points on the board. Give me Notre Dame to come away with a decent win though, 30-21. Michigan's back off a bye and on the road this week, taking on Illinois, who's coming off a near disaster loss to Purdue last week at home. After survival, they sit 5-1, ready to take on a struggling Michigan team, who not only hasn't shown an offensive pulse at this point, but is now having some serious pass defense issues, with the entire secondary being picked apart besides Will Johnson. If that isn't fixed after the bye, Michigan could be in some trouble here, but I think the pass rush can do enough to limit Illinois. Jack Tuttle will be the starting quarterback for the Wolverines after the offense finally showed some light with him, something neither Warren or Orji could find at all. Finally healthy, Tuttle's gotten his first real week of practice, and I think that could definitely bode well for Michigan, especially seeing how easy Purdue was able to run the ball on them. Give me Michigan behind a big day from Mullings and a bit more passing presence from Tuttle, 24-20. Navy's officially ranked in the AP poll along with Army, sitting right in the last spot at 25. Well deserved after how they played the season, putting up some huge numbers with that rushing attack and Blake Horvath. At 5-0, they'll look to reach bowl eligibility this week as they host Charlotte, who's coming off a rushing clinic of their own last week against East Carolina, which was incredibly shocking considering how poorly they've ran the ball all year. It's possible they found something and it continues, but I have definite doubts about it as Navy sees that ground game every day in practice and will be more than prepared to stop it. The defense hasn't been great this season, but the offense has been virtually unstoppable, and I don't see Charlotte changing that. I like Navy to keep rolling on, 41-21 final. Cal hosts NC State this week, hopefully with Jaden Ott back, as he missed a game against Pitt, which ended up being pretty costly as a run game outside of Javian Thomas was non-existent. But regardless, the defense continued to get the job done as they basically shut down Pitt, holding them to just 17 points, but just couldn't score when it mattered and they fell short. For NC State, they're coming off yet another loss, this time at home to Syracuse, where they got a pretty great day from CJ Bailey, but McCord lit them up to take NC State to 0-7 against the spread on the year. And considering they're now traveling across the country to take on what's been a great defense this season, I like the odds of 0-8. Give me Cal to win and cover thanks to one of the biggest turnover margin gaps between two teams all year, 30-17. Kansas and Houston are both back off byes this week and maybe heading in opposite directions as Kansas look to avoid their 6th consecutive loss, and Houston coming off their 2nd win of the year after upsetting TCU as 17-point underdogs thanks to an emergence from Zion Chris. For Kansas, they finally got a great game out of Jalen Daniels, but still fell short as the defense just could not stop Arizona State's rushing attack whatsoever. And looking back, that's not something that's been done much at all this year. With that aside, this is obviously Kansas' best chance at stopping the skid and making something out of this disastrous start to the season. I'm expecting them to come out of this bye fresh and hungry to move forward, and I still believe in Daniels and Neal to put up some better games. I'm not going to buy the Chris hype with Houston here. Give me Kansas to win and cover, 31-20. Hawaii at Washington State's an interesting game to watch this week. Obviously an early one for Hawaii as a 3:30 Eastern start is a morning kickoff over there, but this could be a fun one with the way Washington State's played the past this season. Braden Shager could see a better game than the Boise State one last week. I obviously like John Mateer and the Cougars to win this game, but if Boise beat this team by just 21, I have a hard time picking Washington State to do any better. I think Hawaii scores enough this week to be able to cover a near 3-touchdown spread, but Washington State rolls on with a 38-23 win. Texas State is at Old Dominion this week. Old Dominion's been really competitive this year, even without Jason Henderson, and against some pretty solid teams on the schedule. Texas State's offense definitely could be the best they've faced, though, as this team is clicking on all cylinders offensively, and the defense dominated last week as well. To put it simple, this doesn't seem like a Bowling Green or a Georgia State that Old Dominion can hang around and beat. It'll take their best game to have a shot in this one, and I've got a lot of trust in McLeod and Mahdi right now. I think Old Dominion just runs into a wall this week and isn't able to slow down the Bobcats enough. Give me Texas State 34-20. Miami, Ohio, and Ohio face off this week as the winning duo of the Central and Eastern matchup I went over earlier. Pretty solid wins for both teams as both came on the road against some decent MAC offenses. But after seeing how Central Michigan came back in that game and how Miami, Ohio just never let EMU back in it, I feel a bit stronger about Miami, Ohio's chances this matchup. Preseason, I thought there was a sizable gap between these two teams in favor of Miami, but a really slow start to the year and some tough matchups made this a bit of a different game. But again, after last week, I'm sticking with Miami, Ohio to keep it going in the right direction at home, 27-20. Bowling Green took a tough loss at home to Northern Illinois after they were completely shut down offensively by the Huskies. They'll see a much different level of defense this week, back home taking on 0-6 Kent State. Kent State finally covered a spread last week as they came back and lost to Ball State by just 2 points. Ulatowski threw for almost 400 yards in that one and nearly got the job done, but again, Bowling Green is simply a better team than Ball State, and this one's on the road. Kent State's probably back on blowout watch, but I do like their chances at a cover based on how Ulatowski has looked and how poorly Bowling Green's been playing. 21 is just too high for me in this spot. I've got a 38-21 final for the Falcons. Next in the MAC is Western Michigan at Buffalo. Buffalo's coming off a really impressive home win over Toledo, who I still think is the team to beat in the MAC by the end of the season, so props to the Bulls for getting it done. And that obviously brings up the question, if they can beat Toledo at home, why can't they beat Western too? Western is definitely a solid team and matches up decently here, but they struggled with Akron last week, and the MAC has been a bit all over the place this season. I think Vegas is buying a letdown game from the Bulls here, but I think as long as Buffalo is on point just like last week, they should win this game, especially playing at home. Give me the Bulls as a home dog here, 28-24. Continuing on here with Toledo on the road at Northern Illinois, this could be another great football game between two top-tier MAC teams. Toledo needs a bounce-back game after the Buffalo loss, and NIU is back to playing very good football, especially defensively. This is obviously a really important game for both teams' MAC hopes, but I still think Toledo is the better team of the two and has a pass offense that could give NIU more trouble than some other MAC teams have. The game could go either way, but I think Toledo plays a much better game knowing their backs are a bit against the wall here, and they spoil NIU's homecoming game with a low-scoring 21-17 road win. South Florida and UAB face off this week with both quarterback situations up in the air. We've still got no update on Jacob Zeno, so as of now it'll be Jalen Kitna again until we hear different. And Byron Brown looks like he'll miss extended time for the Bulls, which obviously hurts them big time as they couldn't find any offense without him last week at Memphis. I don't like how UAB has played this season at all, but I feel like they've got a genuine chance to keep this game close with how rough the USF offense looked last week. Jalen Kitna has a couple starts under his belt now and just needs to avoid more turnovers. That's been a big problem for him. I'd expect this to be a lower scoring game than it would be with both guys healthy, and I've got South Florida taking a close one, 30-24. UTSA hosts FAU this week, pretty desperate for a win here, sitting at 2-4 on the year, and it has not gone nearly the way they had hoped as they're coming off back-to-back road losses they could have avoided. 146 yards of penalties cost them big time last week at Rice, but they're finally back in the Alamo Dome where they're 2-0 this season. Cam Fancher and the FAU offense looked real solid last week at home against North Texas, but that defense has given up a ton of points this year, so it may not mean too much. I do expect FAU to give UTSA a real fight here as they're in a bit of a rhythm, and UTSA definitely has some issues, but I do think they've looked a bit different at home and should be able to play a cleaner game for once, and Cam Fancher is questionable, so give me UTSA close, 31-27. Tulane is back home taking on Rice this week, who just picked up a nice upset win over UTSA. EJ Warner balled out, and UTSA shot themselves in the foot quite a bit to make that happen. This week will be a lot different, though, as Tulane has rolled over better teams than Rice this season. Fresh off a bye, I'd expect the offense to pretty much pick up right where they left off and dominate a below-average defense at home. If they look anything like they did in the last three, they could win this game by much more than 3 scores, but I'll go with them taking this one 41-17. Up next is USC at Maryland, another cross-country Big Ten matchup that we've been over a couple times already this video. However, USC showed some real life last week, nearly upsetting Penn State. This is a definite trap game, but one that USC just flat out shouldn't lose. They've already gotten surprised on the road by Minnesota, so I'd expect them to be ready for a war this time around. Maryland looked terrible last week in the loss to Northwestern, especially Edwards, who just seems out of rhythm right now. I'm going to trust the obvious talent gap here between the teams and USC to finally get back in the win column on the road. It'll probably be closer than they hope, but I'll take them by 10, 34-24. On to Colorado at Arizona. I think we've learned to trust Colorado to hang around and compete in the Big 12 the rest of the year. A lot of these teams just aren't that much better than the Buffs, and they've been able to hang around and pick up some wins in conference already. Hanging with Kansas State despite a 14-point deficit was a great sign to me. They nearly had a chance to come away with a win without Hunter as well. Arizona's been super up and down this season, has tons of talent on the roster, but again, it's not hard to think Colorado can compete here. I'm expecting Travis to play this week, which would be super important, and I think Colorado's offense has enough firepower to be able to score enough on Arizona to give them a shot. I'm taking Colorado to cover as I think it once again goes down to the wire, but with a banged up Hunter, I'm going to take Arizona to barely survive, 31-30. Texas Tech and Baylor face off this week with both teams well rested. Baylor's looked a little bit better than I expected this season as Sawyer Robinson's done a pretty solid job at quarterback, but it hasn't resulted in a good record thus far. And they're in for another tough game as Texas Tech sits at 5-1 and keeps rolling coming off an upset over Arizona. I really like this Texas Tech offense with Baron Morton, Taj Brooks, and those receivers. They can score on just about anyone and have won 3 straight conference games. They've really given me no reason to fade them in this game as I just think they're a better team than Baylor, and they've already won some absolute battles already. I've got Texas Tech by more than a touchdown. I'll go 37-28. Over to the Mountain West, we've got Utah State hosting New Mexico. This game total sitting at a whopping 78.5 right now as both defenses have given up a ridiculous amount of yards and points this season. And on the other side of the ball, both offenses have shown they can move the ball and put up some numbers themselves. Despite being home underdogs in this game, I genuinely see Utah State as a better team of the two. New Mexico's wins this season are over New Mexico State and Air Force, maybe the 2 worst teams in the conference this year, and games they were clear favorites in. I think hanging 30+ on Boise and UNLV should give the Aggies some confidence here, just knowing the obvious gap between these teams in New Mexico. At home as well, I'm taking Utah State 38-35. Next is another Mountain West battle between Wyoming and San Jose State. Wyoming coming off maybe a bit of a disappointing loss against San Diego State, which I think was definitely a game they could have came away with. But the season just got worse for the Cowboys, and now sitting at 1-5, they've got to go back on the road to face a pretty strong offense in the Spartans. Nick Nash has been unbelievable this season, but they've got a bit of a question at quarterback now with some shaky play from Emmett Brown. It may be Walker Eaget this week after the Colorado State loss, so we'll see who gets the nod. But regardless, I do think the San Jose State team is just better than Wyoming, and they should be able to pull away from them regardless of who's in. So give me San Jose State 34-20. Next up, James Madison at Georgia Southern. JMU's offense came back alive last week after a complete dud against ULM. ULM might just be an upset wagon this season, and I love how the Dukes responded rebounding from that loss, but Georgia Southern could definitely pose a challenge for this team. They're now 4-2 after beating Marshall, and they can score pretty quick when they're hot. I expect Georgia Southern to do more of the same this week, at least keeping this one competitive for a while, but James Madison has just looked too good this season outside of ULM to think they'll be slowed down again. Give me JMU by double digits, 38-27. A few weeks ago, Mississippi State looked like a dumpster fire, losing a home game to Toledo, and Blake Shapen went down for the year afterwards. But a cover against Texas and an actual competitive game against Georgia with a freshman quarterback may instill some confidence in this program despite the 1-5 record. They've got Texas A&M coming to town looking like a potential SEC contender right now with Wegman back after dismantling Missouri. And with LSU on deck next week, this is a definite look-ahead spot for the Aggies. They looked incredible against Missouri, but a week off combined with a spot up on the road against a team who may finally be hitting their stride. I can see this game being closer than A&M would hope for. With that said, I think they're too good to drop this one, especially defensively, but I don't think they'll cover anything over 2 touchdowns in this game. Give me A&M 31-17. LSU's on a hangover watch this week after an incredibly tough-fought win over Ole Miss in Death Valley last week. They're on the road now against an Arkansas team who's already picked up an upset win in conference over Tennessee this season, with a play-extending quarterback and a defensive line that's had a lot of success this season. This is going to end up being a really tough game for the Tigers. I'm not sure I fully trust Arkansas to stop LSU late in this game, but I definitely think they could have a late lead in this one. With the spread up over a field goal right now, I actually like Arkansas to cover, and I don't hate this as an upset pick, but I've got LSU's offense surviving the upset late on the road, 30-28. Vanderbilt avoided the Bama hangover in a big way last week, taking down Kentucky on the road as well. Diego Pavia has shown a ton of dog in him lately and has really revived this program, putting them in consideration for national ranking. And this week is a potential chance to continue towards that, as they'll host Ball State as heavy favorites. If they continue to play the way they have, they could absolutely roll over this team, but part of me still isn't fully buying the Vandy hype. We've seen this team have some letdowns this year, including a loss to Georgia State, and I could definitely see this being the hangover week after 2 big wins and now facing a completely outmatched team. I think Vandy comes out a little sleepy here and doesn't score enough to cover a near 4 touchdown spread, 37-14. On to Arkansas State and Southern Miss. Southern Miss has finally settled on a quarterback, and it'll be Ethan Crawford, who just had a disastrous week last week on the road at ULM, going 9 for 26 passing. ULM has shut down a lot of offense this season, though, and I don't expect the repeat performance here against Arkansas State. But I will say, I'm not a big fan of Crawford for this team, and I think Arkansas State comes into this game with some confidence now they've gotten through the toughest part of their schedule. They got killed last week at Texas State, but Jalen Rayner and Jaquez Cross still put up some decent numbers. Southern Miss is just not really close to the level of teams they faced this season, and I think they pick up a win here on the road again, 31-20. Finally, on to the game of the week, Georgia at Texas, number 5 at number 1. Quinn Ewers and Carson Beck going head-to-head in a game that could potentially be an SEC title match or decide who goes to it. Georgia has not been playing great football lately, escaping Kentucky, the Alabama loss, an early struggle against Auburn, and just a 10-point win over Mississippi State. But it's hard not to see them putting together their best effort this week against Texas, knowing the importance and level of this game. Texas had looked like the clear-cut better team, and at home, I definitely would be picking them to win this game. I just expect it to be closer than recent results would suggest. Texas has been too dominant to fade in this spot, and I think they win this one by enough to cover a tight spread, but I've got a slightly lower scoring final. I'm going 27-21 Texas. Now back to the Big 12, we've got Iowa State hosting UCF. UCF coming off some really ugly performances and a ton of questions at quarterback, with KJ Jefferson being benched and Ja'Cory Brown having an up-and-down performance against Cincinnati. And on the other end, Iowa State continuing to roll on to 6-0 after a strong road win at West Virginia. They've been really sharp defensively this season, and Rocco Beck did more than enough to control that game offensively as well. I don't think UCF should be too much of a challenge for the Cyclones with the way both teams have played. The Cyclone defense should be able to limit Harvey and Boone enough to force Brown into some really tough passing spots. I think they create a couple takeaways to really control this game. Give me Iowa State 34-17. Another Big 12 matchup Saturday night is Kansas State at West Virginia. Like I've talked about all year with this West Virginia team, it's really hard to tell which Mountaineer team's going to show up. They've had some huge letdowns and some great performances this season, and they've got what it takes to pull off an upset here at home. It's just really hard to trust them right now against teams who've proved me better early on this year. Now at the halfway point, West Virginia is in danger of missing a bowl game, and Kansas State is right in the thick of the Big 12 title race. I don't think the Mountaineers will be able to slow Johnson and Giddens down enough to be able to give them a great chance at an upset, and they're too iffy offensively to trust in this spot, so I'm taking Kansas State on the road to stay in the hunt, 31-24. Moving on to the final Big Ten matchup of the night, it's Iowa at Michigan State. Iowa looked phenomenal last week in a blowout win over Washington, which I think was a clear hangover spot for the Huskies, having to play at that level of defense on the road after taking out Michigan in the title rematch game. And now I can see the same thing going here with Iowa hitting the road at the Spartans. This MSU team has not been good at all, but they've got playmakers, just way too many turnovers. Iowa's defense will probably hold them to a rough offensive night again, but I also don't see Iowa hanging 40 in this game either. Michigan State held Ohio State to 38 and Oregon to 31, and I think they keep Iowa in check enough to keep this one close, but I've got Iowa's defense coming out on top here, 20-17. Next up is North Texas at Memphis, a battle of two high-powered offenses that could lead us to an elite offensive showcase. Seth Hennigan and the Tigers have been pretty good all year, but have kind of slumped a bit the last two games with just 24 and 21 against Middle Tennessee and South Florida. This is an obvious chance to get the offense back on track as North Texas has given up a ton of points this season, but Memphis has faced some really lackluster offenses to make those defensive numbers look better than they performed this year. I think the Mean Green can score enough in this game to hang around, but Memphis just has better talent across the board and should be able to hold on to a win in this one. I'm going with a 38-30 final. DJ Lagway will make his first career start for Florida Saturday night as they take on Kentucky. Graham Mertz is out for the year, which means it's time to look towards the future and give Lagway the keys of the offense. And although last week wasn't the greatest performance ever against a strong Vols defense, he's been pretty solid this season for a true freshman. Kentucky's defense is going to make things tough on him, though, as they've got a good secondary and a strong linebacker unit. Trusting a freshman quarterback is always going to be tough, but he's played a lot already this season and has full support of the team and fans. A home night game might be a perfect opportunity for a first career start, and I think Kentucky's offenses look bad enough to think the Gators can come away with a win here for Lagway. I'm taking Florida as a slight home dog this week, 23-17. Number 21 SMU is back after the bye week in the big road win over a solid Louisville team. This offense has been absolutely cooking lately with Kevin Jennings at the helm. This week they're on the road against a terrible Stanford team who's coming off 3 straight uncompetitive losses to Clemson, Virginia Tech, and Notre Dame. This is once again going to be another tough one for Stanford to compete in with the way SMU's looked after a slow start to the year. The Mustang offense has shown they can roll on the road already, and Stanford is just no match for this team right now. I've got SMU in blowout fashion again here, 38-20. Heading out west, we've got Colorado State at Air Force with some unfortunate news for the Rams as Torrey Horton will be out for the remainder of the season. A big blow to the Ram offense, which seems to finally get going with him healthy. But down again, they'll have to be able to rally without him. Last week was a pretty solid win over San Jose State, who's really started to struggle lately, but Horton had a pretty good impact on that game prior to the injury, and Nicolosi just hasn't looked the same without him. Air Force has been terrible this season, but finally found the round game last week against New Mexico. Maybe that'll help their offense come alive enough to keep this one close at home against a potentially vulnerable Colorado State team. And I think we do get a close game, but I just can't take Air Force to win right now. I'll go Rams 27-21. On to the two late night games, starting with UNLV at Oregon State. The Beavers took a pretty bad loss last week on the road at Nevada, giving up 42 points in the process, a week after Colorado State put up 31. It's clear this team has some defensive issues right now, and Giovanni McCoy threw 4 interceptions, which didn't help in the slightest. They actually outgained the Wolfpack, though, by 140 yards. They just continued to shoot themselves in the foot, which cost them on the road. And now they face a really good UNLV team, with Ricky White just being flat out unguardable right now. The bright side for Oregon State is UNLV's defense has had some troubles this season, and I can see this being a pretty high-scoring game. I like Oregon State to compete and keep this one within a touchdown, but UNLV coming out on top, 34-30. The final game of the week has lost a lot of juice now. It's Utah and TCU. TCU coming off a bye week after an upset loss to Houston, and Utah announcing Cam Rising will miss the remainder of the season with yet another injury. It'll be freshman Isaac Wilson the rest of the way, and he's had a pretty rough season besides the Utah State game. I don't have much confidence in him being able to win games for the Utes, so until he shows that, I think they'll have to rely on the ground game and defense being able to carry them to wins. TCU really needs this one to put the Houston loss behind them, but their defense just has been so bad basically all season. Utah probably won't score enough to win this game handily, but I just don't think TCU has enough to finish the job on the road. Give me Utah by a field goal, 27-24. That's it for my Week 8 picks. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, as well as your upset predictions of which games you're looking forward to most this weekend. As always, thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.